right now. We are recording, so everybody knows. And welcome. I hope everyone's doing well today. Welcome to the DH at Wake lecture series. The DH at Wake series is presented by ZSR Library. And today our speaker is Caitlin Marley, who will be introduced shortly by THM Geller-Goad, who is the co-organizer. Thank you to Professor Geller-Goad and the Department of Classics for helping us organize this event today. Just a few tech things before we get started. If you have any questions about tech, please feel free to drop it in the chat. You can message Molly Keener directly, who will be taking care of all of the tech issues during the talk today. We will also be taking questions through the chat, and we'll run a live verbal Q&A as well after. So if you want to drop a question in the chat for Caitlin to answer after the talk, please feel free to do that, or you can wait until the Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to THM Geller-Goad to introduce our speaker today.
All righty. Caitlin A. Marley is instructor in world languages and cultures at Bowling Green State University. She's interested in Cicero, both his oratory and his letters, ancient emotions, text analysis, and digital humanities. In 2018, she successfully defended her dissertation titled Sentiments, Networks, Literary Biography, towards a mesoanalysis of Cicero's corpus, and she graduated with her PhD. In 2011, she received a BA in classics with a minor in psychology from Wake Forest University. So she's a demon deacon at heart, I think. I first encountered her work on the SCS blog, the Society for Classical Studies blog, where she had a really insightful and amazing post about what digital humanities can show us about Cicero. So I'm really excited to learn more about that today. So I'll pass it on over. Thank you, Caitlin.
All right, and thank you everybody for coming here today. I was very happy to be welcomed back here as a former demon deacon, or actually still demon deacon in heart. Although I can't be there in person, this is the next best thing, right? So thank you for coming, and let's talk about the shape of emotions in Cicero's speeches. So when I was a fresh graduate student in a classics program, I never thought my research would involve statistical analyses of texts. Probably didn't even think it was possible. But the very last course that I took as a student was on distant reading techniques. We slowly walked through Matthew Jockers' book, which is a very good place to start, and played with a few other software like our Stylo and topic modeling programs. Then my eyes were opened to the wondrous world of digital humanities and the research opportunities that it could hold. Now, as a person researching Latin, there's not a lot new about Latin, right? So this was it. This was my chance to finally say something new in Latin. But alas, these programs were not made for the Latin language. But you can coerce them into learning Latin or any other foreign language, any other non-English language, I should say. This can be done through a combination of R packages and Python scripts. Fortunately, for burgeoning digital humanists, there are a plethora of tutorials and toolkits out there to help you along the way. Although being able to decipher this takes some getting used to. But if you can read a foreign language, you can gradually learn how to read this too. But before I get ahead of myself, let's go back to the beginning, my beginning, with this guy, Matthew Jockers. He's a professor of English and data analytics from Washington State University, with a literary training in Irish and Irish American literature of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I have to credit him because not only did I learn the basics of R through his book, but I also adapted his idea of mapping out plots of novels to my own research. Inspired by a lecture of Kurt Vonnegut that one day computers would be able to read and map out plots of the stories, Jockers set out to do just that. He built an R package called Suiset, which could map out the emotional valence of a novel, which theoretically followed the protagonist's highs and lows throughout the story, as you can see with this novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, with plot points near the highs and lows of the story. Now, this package and method wasn't without its critics. Most of the critiques circled around the filters and the lexicons that Jockers had used for his research. And as a result, the package had a couple of iterations until it reached the final form that it has now. So this was the earliest form the package was. Then it moved to this kind of very basic form. And then lastly, this is the form that it's currently in today. In the end, Jockers did discover the typical patterns of plot that the novels tended to fall into. And so I studied Jockers' progress very closely through his blog posts. I have him credited right here. And I learned a lot from this series of trials and errors before I set out on my own. Which brings me to another person, this man, Marcus Tullius Cicero, an advocate and a politician of the late Roman Republic. Now, I didn't necessarily choose to work with Cicero, the circumstances did, because when it comes to statistics, the bigger the data set, the better. And while Cicero's corpus is still considered to be very, very small by DH standards, he was quite the prolific writer. You have 60 individual speeches, 7 rhetorical works, 8 extant philosophical works, 10 fragmented treatises, and over 900 letters. So he wrote a lot, and he also had a great influence in the Roman world and also in Roman literature in general. So much so that we teach our students Latin in accordance with his style. Fortunately for me, I like Cicero. Many people do not for his arrogant and bombastic personality, but also that's what makes him so compelling. He is able to inspire such love or animosity from people. But what people can generally agree upon is that he was one hell of an orator. He was the best. Even up to the Middle Ages, he was known as the king of eloquence. And it was that eloquence of his speeches that drew me right in. Now, before this, my research interest typically lied in audiences' reception of work. What was this work originally like in its first context? Who was it written for? How did it make him feel? I wanted to do something similar for Cicero's speeches, but I didn't quite know how. This might have been due to how we normally interact with his speeches from a functional, stylistic, or rhetorical standpoint. Functionally, you can divide up his speeches into these 3 categories. You have epidictic, deliberative, or judicial, which of course the speeches are categorized into based on what you're writing the speech for. Epidictic, are you trying to urge an audience into a certain action, or are you deliberating an action? Or judicial, are you speaking in front of a court? Then that's the category it would fall into. From a stylistic standpoint, you have the following. You have high, middle, or low. These are typically differentiated by sophistication of style and lexical richness. Now, what style of speech you use depends upon the situation and, of course, who's listening to the speech. From a rhetorical standpoint, we tend to divide individual speeches into the following parts. Every speech will have an exordium, an oratio, a partitio, a confirmatio, a refutato, a digresso, a peroratio, which actually is optional that you could have. When Cicero himself describes the functions of each of these parts in his rhetorical handbooks, you can see a common theme: how and when to emotionally manipulate your audience. In the beginning, during your exordium, the first part of the speech, Cicero tells you how to turn a hostile audience into a sympathetic one, or as he says in his own words, how to bring the mind of the hearer into a suitable state to receive the rest of the speech. And at times, during the speech, it's better to be straightforward, like during the confirmatio, when you're laying out your own argument and providing evidence. Because you want to appear as an authoritative and trustworthy figure, maybe don't emotionally manipulate at this part. As you can see, how we break down the speeches tends to circle around just one thing: emotions. How do we want the audience to feel about a certain action or person? What style would be appropriate to induce this feeling? What style can heighten this emotion or diminish it? And what point in the speech do we pull at their heartstrings, and when do we restrain from doing so? So, Why don't we just analyze and categorize the speeches by their use of emotional appeals? Because when it comes to emotional appeals, Cicero was really your guy to do it. He was the master of them. Not only did he write extensively about emotional appeals in his handbooks, but it was literally his job. Now, not every speech that Cicero made was given in this situation, but occasionally, in Roman law courts, the prosecution and defense were made up of teams of three. The first two of each team would typically go over the details of the case, refute some claims made by the prosecution, and present evidence. The last man delivered the closing speech, the last chance to get the judges and the jury on their side, the last chance to make them feel pity for your client and anger at your opponent, the last chance to beg for mercy or to call to action. And that speech was often given by none other than Marcus Tullius Cicero. So my mind was made up. I was going to organize Cicero's speeches by their emotional appeals, plotting his use of positive and negative emotions to sway the people onto his side. But there was just one problem. Jockers' package could only read English texts. So I had to Frankenstein my own and create my own sentiment lexicon. The process can be summed up in these three not so easy steps. Basically, I used the dictionary method, meaning that I associated word with a certain number, from -3 to +3. Now, why did I pick this range? Well, Jockers' critics were dissatisfied with his lexicons that ranked words only from -1 to +1. So I took a hint and expanded the range a little bit from -3 to +3. But before I could rank the words, I had to collect them. And so I looked through Cicero's most frequent words used in his entire corpus and pulled out around 1,000 positive and negative terms. Then I started ranking. So at plus or minus ones, you have things that are called opinion words, words like beautiful, wonderful, good, bad, evil, words with obvious positive or negative connotations. For example, we have one of those opinion words on here. At number 12, you have admiratio. Admiration, that's a good thing, +1. On this picture, you also have at number 8, accuso, to blame somebody. That's a bad thing, so it's ranked at -1. So at plus and -2 are emotional words and psychophysical responses that you feel when you're feeling an emotion. So that would be like blushing or your heart racing or laughing. Now, I rank these terms as positive or negative in correspondence with Stoic emotional theory, which I don't really expect you guys to be so familiar with, but the point is, Cicero was familiar with Stoic emotional theory, so much so that he wrote an entire book about it. So I used basically Cicero's own words against him at this point in time. And when he was laying out Stoic emotional theory, he basically laid out the process of how one feels emotions, and he categorized the emotions as either a response to perceived good or evil. For example, metus is a Latin word for fear. It's a response to a perceived evil, so it's at -2. But gaudio, to feel joy, is a response to perceived good, so +2. Now, plus or -3 are for intense feelings. So you can feel afraid, temesco, or you can feel very afraid, pertemesco. And then you also have weighty words. Now, if you're wondering what some of those weighty words are, you can actually see some in this picture. Words having to deal with adultery. And as you can imagine, during the Roman period, adultery was very bad. So I ranked it at -3. So after ranking over 1,000 words in this way, it was time to turn it into a script. I used the R package called Quant EDA, which is described as a fast, flexible, and comprehensive framework for quantitative text analysis. And indeed, this package does allow for relatively quick text exploration. Through this package, a user can explore keywords and contexts, analyze the metadata of texts, make a word cloud visualization, perform a topic modeling on a corpus, and create dictionaries, which is what I used. Now, I did have a few issues while creating the dictionary, while writing the script. As you can see, if you look at the script a little bit closely, I had to upload the dictionary in parts and then combine them together. But I was eventually able to get a sentiment score for every section of the speeches, which I could then use to map, which was also easier said than done. First of all, I had to perform some of the calculations outside of R, as you can see by the Excel sheet. The dictionary through QuantityDA was able to place words into certain category, but not really give them a numerical value. So I had to go and do that myself. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, Jockers' process had two major critiques: the limited lexicons that only went from plus to -1, and his filters. Now, I'm not a statistician, I'm a classicist. And so I just went with what was most commonly recommended to Jocker, which was the rolling average and the lowest filter. And for mapping, I used the package ggplot2, as it is described as the most elegant and aesthetically pleasing graphic framework available in R. And indeed, you have several options in this package. You can do a scatter plot, a line graph, a pie chart, a bar graph. The list really can go on and on and on, really. I actually have a lot more graphs in this page, but I'll spare you from that. But what I liked about ggplot2 is that you had the option of layering graphs together, which is what I had to do because I couldn't put a rolling average on the other graph with the lowest filter. And so I had to merge those two graphs together. Now, at this point, I want to talk about why it's important to have filters in an analysis like this, because you need to smooth out the data points. This is all about finding the trend between the data points. And sometimes the trend in emotional trajectory is pretty obvious, just like in the speech on the right. It begins with high positive sentiment and then dips down only to pick up in positive sentiment again before it ends on a negative note. This is the emotional journey that Cicero takes his audience through during his speeches. Now, I found 9 typical journeys that Cicero leads us on, which I cleverly named after letters in the Greek alphabet. So you have shape alpha, which just is a general ascent in positivity. Then you have beta, which is a general descent into negativity. Then you have shapes delta and gamma, which kind of oppose each other. Delta dips down into sentiment in the middle, and then gamma that rises in positive sentiment only to fall back down again. Epsilon is very similar to delta, but it dips down in negativity in the beginning of the speech. I already talked about the shape zeta, but its opponent is the shape eta that has the opposite sort of journey. Then you have the roller coaster that is the shape theta, which kind of just takes people on a great emotional journey. And then lastly, shape iota, which just appears to be a flat line. I'm going to get to that. Don't worry about it. So let's start with a speech that has a simple and rather obvious trajectory. This is shape alpha, a constant and gradual ascent into positivity. So what kind of speech is this? You probably guessed it. It's a deliberative speech that exhorts the listeners into a positive action. The 11th Philippic, which is this speech, was delivered in front of the Roman Senate and addressed the question who should take command of power and act against this evil villain Dolabella, who just so happened to be Cicero's own ex-son-in-law. So a lot of family ties there. Dolabella had made himself an enemy to Rome by infiltrating Smyrna in Asia and murdering the governor of that province, most likely by torture. Hence the rather negative sentiment at the start of this speech. Dolabella's actions and character are likened to Mark Antony, a favorite target of Cicero's ire. Cicero claimed that Antony was Dolabella's teacher of evilness, so that's how bad Antony was. While it was unanimous that Dolabella was a public enemy, the Senate was divided in opinion about how to dispose of him. And while the Senate was debating between two options, Cicero, being the person he is, rejected both of them and proposed a third. He believed that a man named Cassius should take command since he was already positioned in the area and was otherwise unengaged. The Senate was ultimately unconvinced by the speech that Cicero had given, and they decided to award command to the consuls. However, Cicero got the last laugh because the course of action he proposed happened nonetheless. Cassius, Cicero's choice, unaware of the Senate's decision, had already marched into Asia and took back control of the province from Dolabella. Anyways, let's focus on the trajectory of the speech. So deliberative speeches like this one have two functions. You have advising and dissuading. And Cicero did both of those things within the speech. He refuted the proposals that were already presented by his colleagues and then offered his own. Interestingly, the sections in which Cicero was trying to dissuade the senators, the sentiment appears to rise in positivity constantly. This could possibly be due to the method of dissuading that Cicero was adopting. When people differ in opinion about what option is more expedient, as they did in this case, then it must be considered whether integrity, the moral of the character, is important or is expediency the chief concern. So in these sections, Cicero talked about integrity and morality. He also drawed upon the precedents of their ancestors. And in Rome, hearkening back to the traditions of the ancestors was basically a power play, urging his audience to think about moral worth of their actions. It's also important to note that Cicero is talking to his peers, his allies, so he did not want to offend these men and spoke about them rather kindly. As a result, his language, and therefore the sentiment mapped in this graph, was rather positive, and it grew in positivity while discussing the potential commanders. The trajectory appears to stabilize when Cicero brings up his choice, Cassius. Cicero mentioned Cassius was the most natural option and that he acted in accordance with the will of the gods. It's positive, but not emotionally overwrought. He could have gone way higher in positivity, but he refrained. This type of speech, according to Cicero himself, would not suit the occasion. He was speaking in front of the Senate, who are more likely to be persuaded by less splendor in speech. Plus, they're all well aware of what kind of person Cicero is. So if Cicero were to use this opportunity to show off his rhetorical skills, he might have drawn in suspicions from his senators. And therefore, in order to avoid suspicion and to persuade the senators, Cicero rather plainly suggested his plan. While the speech ended on a relatively flat note, it began darkly, as you can see. This is because of the exordium, the first part. Deliberative speeches don't always require a formal exordium, but some semblance of one. In this case, it was necessary because Cicero faced such an hostile audience that most likely, and in fact did, oppose his suggestion. He had attempted to win the goodwill of his audience from the beginning by lamenting the death of the governor and denouncing Dolabella and Antony. This, in accordance with Cicero's own rhetorical advice, he wrote that in order to attain benevolence from an audience, an orator should speak at length about the misfortunes that have happened or the difficulties that are still transpiring. Here, Cicero did both. And as a result, the exordium has the lowest points, and the sentiment generally rises from there onwards. So even a simple shape like alpha can reveal much about the speech and the context in which it was delivered. One could guess from a graph that Cicero was trying to spur his audience into positive action from a negative situation. And he did so without extreme language and style. Furthermore, this graph also seemed to correspond not only with the context of the speech, but with also the appropriate rhetorical strategies from rhetorical theory. Now, let's move on to a speech with a little more exciting trajectory, which is shape zeta. Now, I chose this speech, because I brought it up earlier. This speech is post reditum in senatu. It was the first speech that Cicero made upon his return from exile, and it was delivered in front of his peers in the Senate, as the name implies. This speech was a speech of thanks, a panegyric, given to those who recalled him back into the city, back home in Rome. Back to civic life. According to Cicero, in a situation like this, a panegyric, the orator must relay the events in a way that brings pleasure to the audience. So we're in for a trip. It was not his main goal to convince the audience that these events happened. Instead, his main concern is to influence the audience's emotions. This To do so, he often used frequent use of surprising or unexpected events because feelings of anticipation and of surprise would make the speech a lot more pleasurable to hear. For Cicero, at least, the news of his exile, which he recounted in the speech, was the most surprising, so you can kind of guess where that comes in on this trajectory. And he made use of that in his speech. The building of suspense that Cicero recommended can be seen in the trajectory. Cicero began with a showering of thanks upon the people who were responsible for their recall, including their ancestors, all of the Roman people, and the immortal gods. Afterwards, he alluded to how the efforts for his recall were thwarted by his political rivals, and the state fell into such lawlessness that even the mighty Pompey the Great locked himself in the away in his house, afraid of being killed. He then went on to describe the situation at Rome, which was so bleak that he did not dare to hope for recall for a return. This description was surrounded by reprieves of praise for those who continued to fight on Cicero's behalf. As a result, the trajectory in sentiment, although still slowly declining, does not reach the lowest point yet. Before Cicero could talk positively about his recall, he still needed to finish laying out the conditions of his exile and to blame those who were responsible for it, namely the consuls at that time. When Cicero is censuring these two men, the trajectory begins to go to the most negative point. And at the end of this tirade against the former consuls, Cicero finally talks about his exile. And he talks about it as if it was his death, even mentioning how he paid funeral expenses when his estate was burned and plundered. Also, his exile was not only his death, but the death of the entire republic. A little dramatic. From that point onwards, the sentiment begins to become more and more positive. First, Cicero praised Milo, his friend, for legally pursuing his cause and even impeaching his enemy for violence. This praise was then spread to everybody who helped Cicero be recalled, and Cicero expressed how he would always feel indebted to them for allowing him to be reborn again as a Roman citizen and politician. The zenith of this praise came when Cicero described the senators finally rising up against his political rivals and proclaimed that Cicero indeed saved the republic with his actions and should be recalled. All of this anticipation and suspense that Cicero had built with his narrative led to that confrontation, led to that climax. The following sections are essentially falling action. From that point onwards, the trajectory begins to decline. Even though Cicero was still giving thanks to those who had aided him, that could be due to the fact that Cicero discussed in detail the adversity that his allies had faced for his cause, especially when the orator thanked Pompey. However, that does not explain why the trajectory crosses the x-axis for a third time and dips into pure negativity, and the speech ends on a rather negative note. The ending is Cicero's appeal towards the audience. Cicero was on a quest to reestablish and regain his former status, dignity, and authority, what he had before he was exiled. And so he had to present himself to the audience the best that he could. In a rhetorical handbook, Cicero writes that the audience's love could be won if an orator established that he had their best interest in mind. The orator had to make it clear that his actions weren't done for any personal benefit, but for your benefit instead. So, with that in mind, although the exile was shameful and forced upon, Cicero claimed that he basically sacrificed himself for the good of Rome, for the good of the Republic by leaving it. Furthermore, the dip in negative sentiment could be done in order to incite compassion from the audience. At this moment, an orator, as Cicero says, should invite the audience to contemplate their own adversities, to think about their own past experiences and lament over the ruin of somebody else who is a good person, a righteous person. That's important. Since the audience had never experienced exile himself, and Cicero was already contemplating his own exile and his own experiences, the orator finished his speech with a lament of those great men who had been exiled like Cicero, but unlike Cicero, they had not been recalled. With such an ending, Cicero was able to express his gratitude and earn compassion from his audience and show that exile was the true evil and not the men who are exiled. Now that we can see that Cicero's rhetorical strategies, context, and emotional valence all match up, let's move on to the speech with seemingly no trajectory. So this is shape iota, a flat line. There is a reason why the lowest filter deduced that it's flat. Just look at it. Where is the trend in there? It's all over the place in sentiment. It's going up and down, a little wiggly line. So what is this speech? This is the Procluentio. Cicero delivered this speech on behalf of his client Cluentius, who was accused of poisoning a man named Obianchius. Remember him, he'll come up again. And before Cicero even opened his mouth to deliver this wonderful mess of a speech, his client Cluentius was already infamous among the Romans because 8 years earlier he was charging Obianchius of attempted poisoning against him and had won. Many people in Rome were convinced that Cluentius had only won the case because he had bribed the jury. As a result, the jury for the Procluentio case were already prejudiced against Cluentius and were well aware of his bad relationship with Obianchius. So Cicero had a difficult job that laid ahead of him for his trial and a pretty hostile audience. He tried to resolve this prejudice against his client by painting Obianchius as the true villain and not Cluentius. The result is described as a constant sustained interest with variety, a consummate blend of humor and pathos, of negative argument, of description, and of declamation, while every part is subordinated to the purpose of the whole. As you can see, how people describe this speech can be as confusing as, trying to find the trend within the speech, because it really just goes all over the place. And this is also because Cicero claimed to use all different styles, high, middle, and low, when he was writing this speech. And later, he boasted that he had thrown dust into the eyes of the jury through this confounding strategy. Cluentius had indeed killed and murdered Obianchius, but Cicero convinced the jury otherwise. In response to Cicero's boast, Quintilian, a later grammarian, commented, "When a painter with his artistic skill makes it so that we believe that certain objects that project from the picture and others objects recede into the background, he himself knows very well that all of the objects are on the same plane." And I think Quintilian's quote appears to be drawn right into the graph. Some sections of the speech appear to project above the x-axis and others fall below it. So foreground, background. However, the fluctuations in positivity and negativity are so irregular that the relationship between the viewpoints are a flat line, and everything is on the same negative plane. So the iota shape here is more indicative of Cicero intentionally being difficult to follow rather than the simplicity of the speech, because the Procluentio is really anything but simple. So now that I have talked about the shape of emotions, in my remaining time, I'd like to talk about the color of them. I know that maybe many of you don't really have interest in rhetorical speeches or in emotional manipulation that Cicero does do, but you might be interested in interpersonal relationships. As I mentioned previously, Cicero wrote a lot, including over 400 letters to his friends and family and acquaintances, which I have presented in this graph. This is a sort of like heat map of sentiment, how positive or negative that he felt towards one person or another. Now, you might think that Cicero's feelings for his wife would be red hot, but it's a little bit cooler than that. It's pretty yellow. And a lot of scholars do talk about Cicero's coldness to his wife Terentia. Now, this is probably because these letters were written a few years before the divorce, so the scholars tend to read a lot into that. But we should also consider that a person can be a little bit more vulnerable and curt to the members of the household. And it's not like his feelings towards Terentia are ice cold, as some of the scholars would lead you to believe. Because at the other end of the spectrum, we have someone who's even colder than ice cold, it's like absolute zero, and that is unknown Titus. This is the most negative letter in the whole entire collection. And that is because Cicero is writing to Titus, who had lost his children, possibly to plague. So, all throughout the letter is a sense of shared mourning and consolation. So, just like with the speeches, we can focus more on the effect that the letters give off to the intended audience rather than dissecting what each and every single word means. And that's a thought that I'd like to leave you guys with. That perhaps with this new age digital methods, we may be closer to feeling the original and full effect of these speeches and see how Cicero was the master of emotions, how he manipulated his peers, and how he interacted with those around him, interacted and felt about those around him. And I also hopefully made you feel like you can do this too, because I was a complete novice at all DH stuff before I did this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marley, for a really fascinating introduction to your work, and which is a really rich body of material that I'm really excited to hear more from you over months and years to come. So I guess it's time to open it now to questions. I don't see any that have been pasted in the chat, so I think I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Johnston to moderate a Q&A live. And apparently you can unmute yourself at any time to ask a question.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Marley. That was excellent. I learned so much, and I will open the floor for questions. And since I can't see everyone on the screen, please just go ahead and unmute yourself to ask questions of Dr. Marley.
Caitlin, this is Robert Ulrey. I have a question.
Hi.
How are
Good. How are you? It's been a long time.
It has. I'm fixating on the assignment of words to the 1, 2, and 3, positive and negative, and how you correct for the distance between us and the time that Cicero is writing the speech and giving the speech. Our perceptions of the words may be completely different from the perception, even if you're using Stoic theory
Yeah.
in the process.
Yeah, that was something I was well aware of, and I talk a little bit about it more in my dissertation because I'm very well aware that how we approach some terms are very different than how the Romans would approach some of these terms. Like, I had a problem with the term shame because feeling shame in the Roman thought, which is a kind of like a good thing, right? If you had shame, you would act a little bit more proper. But I bet like today, if you look at any sort of lexicon, shame would probably be categorized as something more negative. Now, when I was reading into this, I really looked at Robert Castor's work in emotions because he really focuses on ancient emotions in the world. So I kind of borrowed his definitions for some of the words and try to get myself into the ancient mindset as much as I could. And that was also the reason why I kind of went through the Tusculan disputations by Cicero so closely, because when he was categorizing some of these words, I could be like, okay, so he thinks that this word is associated with fear and all of that kind of stuff. So I kind of just, use Cicero's categorizations and how he uses the words to my advantage. Now, it's not perfect. And it's also something that's very tailored to just Cicero's works. I probably wouldn't recommend anybody using this lexicon in any work that is not by Cicero. And that's also something that people do recommend if you guys are interested in using lexicons or creating your own, is that you have to consider how the author uses their own words, not just in the ancient context, but even in modern contexts today, because it's going to change from person to person, because we use words differently and we feel about words differently. So I kind of went off a little bit, but that's something that's always recommended when you're doing a sentiment analysis anyway. So it's something that I did struggle with, but I tried to do my best by reading up on current scholarship about ancient emotions and tried to adapt that into that. He did a lot of work with emotional scripts in the ancient world and kind of categorized words accordance with that. But thank you, Dr. Ulrich.
And Caitlin, there's a suggestion. Do you mind if you just stop sharing your screen so we can have even more of us on our little Zoom tiles? No, don't be sorry at all. Just wanted to get more faces on the screen.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, other questions?
I was personally wondering, also thank you so much for the talk. Super interesting. Digital humanities is like really, really cool. I think all the stuff you did with Cicero is like fascinating.
Oh, thank you.
I was wondering how did you pull these top 1,000 words? I noticed you mentioned that. Is that some sort of code? Because I can only imagine going, and there's no way you can physically do that by hand. So
yeah, so you can do that through R. It's one of the basic functions in R is that's why I kind of plugged in Jockers' book as much as I can, because that is one of the first thing he teaches you is how to collect a list of most frequent words. And so it's actually a lot easier than it seems. So while it, did take some time to collate the list together, basically just let the computer do the work for you. So yeah, it's a lot easier than it looks, but I think I collected more than 1,000, so I can get 1,000 words of positive or negative sentiment. So if you were thinking about doing a similar thing, you have to realize that you'll have to look at more words than words that you'll actually be able to use when you do a thing like that.
Because because there's the different Latin endings, seems like super. Like,
okay,
that was much words.
I'm kind of glad you brought that up because that was something I had in my lecture, but then I was like, oh my God, I'm getting too technical. I need to take it out. So the thing with that is that there's something called stemming that you do to a corpus before you do something like most frequent words, or actually most of these functions that you would do, like a word cloud or whatnot. So it's called stemming, which is you take the word at its root. And so that the computer would read words like bonus, bony, bonorum, all the forms of bonus as the same word rather than separate words. Now, this function actually exists. We have a script for the Latin language through the Classical Language Toolkit. It's not only available for Latin, but all sorts of languages on there. I think there's Coptic and like Akkadian and all sorts of things. So they'll do that processing for you. So when you do the most frequent words, all forms of bonus will be added into the one entry rather than separate entries on that. So that was a really good question.
I've got a quick question. Thank you for this. It was really interesting.
Oh, no.
I'm following up on the lexicon. When you pulling the top, you said 1,000 is what you said. What was the number?
Oh, well, I ended up with 1,000 because this was also my dissertation, so I had a little bit more free time to do all of this stuff, admittedly. But I looked at over 1,000 in order to pull those words.
Did you end up with a set the lexicon that you used that was biased towards more negativity than positivity, so that your default lexicon was already skewed, or is that something you took into account?
It was something that I took into account because, yeah, I can't admit that I don't have my own bias when I am creating a lexicon like this, and especially when we're considering Cicero. In like some of the cases that he presents, some of the words and some of the situations that he has is going to be fairly negative. The hope is when you do a sentiment analysis like this is that things end up balancing out. So it is a lot easier, and your lexicon, I think, will tend towards more the negative than the positive. And admittedly, mine probably does. But the hope is that it would all kind of even out. And that's also another reason why the filters are important, because it will kind of focus more on the trends rather than what the actual scores are.
If I could, just one kind of follow up. I know that when working with a lexicon where you're looking for words and assigning sentiment and sort of aggregating over words, there's clearly cases where a word can be negated and then be the exact opposite valence. Did you look into any of this, see how potentially common or not common it was in terms of, I mean, I don't know, is that something you thought about?
Well,
'Cause
I
usually
did.
it's a problem.
I did include stop words in there that I was aware was going to probably change the sentiment of the thing. However, there wasn't so much I could do as a complete novice to all of this. So that was something else I had to throw my hands up in. There is something more sophisticated. I think it was the Stanford lexicon, what they have there focuses a lot more on like the syntax version of everything. But as one person creating all of this on her own, unfortunately, it was not able to do that. But it was something that I was very concerned about, try to make affordance for that within my own lexicon. But, sometimes in the end of the day, you're like, this is as close as I'm going to get to some of these things.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Hey there. Thanks for this. This is really fascinating. We've got a couple of questions. One of them has to do with sort of like the state of the field, and the other one is a methodological question too. So I'm wondering, do you, and my Latin 212 students here who are here will appreciate this. To what extent, if any, is there scope for accounting for things like reported speech? So in other words, someone says that somebody else is saying these words. I mean, I understand that those words still have a negative valence, but I wonder if there's any like rationale or possibility of adjusting based on who's talking, right? Whose words are in whose mouths, and of course that could vary depending on the nature of the reported utterance, right? So that's one, and then the other one is like I've been daunted by considering doing something like this because of the scope of it, and also this prevailing sense that I'm always afraid that someone else has already done it or doing it somewhere else. So like, I know there's like the quantitative criticism lab at UT Austin that does other stuff on like stylometry, and I don't know. I guess wondering like what is the sense of community like within classics, at least for doing this kind of thing? Like, is there a strong network of people who are doing this? Are people like talking to each other so that they know that they're not? I mean, obviously, it's people will do their own work, but right, like that they're making it so that they're being collaborative and effective, or is it like more kind of competitive to the point of feeling that folks are being out scooped, let's say, on one thing or another? So two totally different questions.
For the first question, I would say that because I was focusing mainly on speeches, and
Right.
so I would think that Cicero is bringing up other people's words to have the same emotional impact, I would say. I mean, he's just not going to bring up a quote of like a high positivity when he's talking about something that he wants people to feel negative about. And so I would still think that even though those words are in somebody else's mouth, the emotional effect that Cicero wants that quote to have on the audience would probably be relatively similar to what's going on around that quote. Does that?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, right. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, I can hypothesize situations where that wouldn't be true, but it doesn't mean that it's not overall a worthy way.
Yeah, right. So that's the thing that's always going to happen with some of these things. It's like it's going to work out in some situations, but is it going to work out in all? Maybe not. But we're just trying to work, I guess, with the general rule and not really the exceptions. But in the other question that you did have, I'm kind of still I feel like the community as I've seen it thus far in DH within classics is actually fairly positive. Everybody is very supportive of what I have seen in it. I've been given a lot of opportunities like this to share my research. And when I do go to conferences, there are people, we do kind of like get together and talk about a few things, and we do want to talk through things. Now, is there some overlap? Yes. I can't tell you how many emails I got from students being like, oh my God, you're doing something with Cicero's letters and DH. And I'm just like, yeah, but you can approach these topics from all sorts of different angles. And I like to relate it back to science, to like medicine. There are many, many people who are doing the same exact research, the same exact experiments over in science, but it's really kind of the variables that you switch up and your own perspective that you offer on some of these things or the conditions that you do, which is going to change a lot into it. I mean, it's kind of like what we typically do with research is sometimes you're talking about the same exact thing, but your approach to it will change. Like I said, we all kind of have inherent biases when we are doing these sorts of things. So the results probably will change. Um, but I have gotten a lot of support. Classicists, from what I have seen, they kind of embrace DH and they do want to help you out. I was given a lot of help at the University of Iowa. Professor Tulia over there was my advisor on the dissertation, and he helped me kind of figure out how to do a lot of these things. I worked or talked a lot with Sarah Bond. She wasn't very, I mean, she was interested in what I was doing, but she's kind of more about like mapping. So she wasn't so into textual analysis. But it's very, I would say, supportive and welcoming. And of course, you're going to have some people like freaking out, like, oh my God, are we doing the same exact thing? But the differences between your approaches really matter.
Thanks.
Something I'm curious about is how do you deal, or what is your recommendation for dealing with textual cruxes and the like? It's maybe something that is less of a problem for working on Cicero than for working on some other texts that are not as have not been as well liked over the millennia as Cicero. But how do you get around those limitations there, I guess?
Can you define what you mean by cruxes a little bit more?
Like we have problems with the text where either there's a gap missing, or the received text doesn't make sense, that sort of thing. I work on Roman comedy, so
there's a lot of
filled with problems like that.
Yeah, I mean, that is like I said, I kind of want to relate this back to science once again, because I have like I was kind of raised in a more kind of like science-based family. So I kind of always had this in the back of my mind. Conditions, even for scientific experiments, they're never going to be perfect. But you kind of perform things as if they are. But you have to admit the faults within your own things, your text, when you're writing these things. Now, I had used some speeches that did have some gaps in them, kind of ignored that. I did mention that that was a problem, but at that point, I didn't really know how to go about it. And maybe that is a question that we as a community in DH that we can begin to talk about. I think it was Ryan Horn who was at UNC. I have no idea where he is now. But he talked about how to represent ambiguity. And this was something that we really need to talk about. And I agree, it's something that we need to talk about, and it's kind of hard to come to a decision upon that. It's kind of a unique situation to classicists and other people dealing with ancient texts, that a lot of people don't have these huge gaps that we do have. So there's probably a way you can account for that, but I don't think we have come to a consensus about how to deal with that yet. Sorry for really kind of giving you a non-answer.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
I have a question. Is there a way to distinguish or plot different kinds of negative and positive emotions? Like, for example, I would think like mourning or sadness is different than anger. And so like, would that be like both negative, or is there a way to see the differences?
So I did categorize them as both negative, but while I was creating my lexicon, because I forget what English lexicon does kind of categorize things a little bit better. There's like even a lexicon that will not give things numerical values, but more so emojis. Anyways, but there are some things that kind of focus more on emotions. I had thought about doing that. But hadn't quite gotten there yet. So I just kind of had to be straightforward. They're both just negative. But in my data set that I do have, when I analyzed all of these emotions, I was sure to say, group all of the sad words together and group all the angry words together in case I wanted to use that later on. So it was something that I had in mind, but didn't really have enough time to get around to.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It was a great question.
I have a, sorry.
Yeah. I don't want to interrupt really quick. It's just because John mentioned the idea of the collaborative nature or people working together. And it made me think about whether the work you've done, the coding, are you keeping in a repository like GitHub or something like this? I mean, these are often good places to get people to network and share data, lexicons, tools.
Yeah, I think I currently have it on a GitHub. I'll be honest, I created that GitHub initially so that my committee could look at it and stuff. But I did kind of, because I didn't want to hoard this, especially since I think, as you could probably see, I think there's ways to improve upon what I did. We brought up a lot of problems that I might have had with my lexicon, which I think is great. I mean, I don't take offense to any of that because I'm like, yeah, I know this is a problem and I want it to be improved on. So I do have it on a GitHub somewhere, but I kind of forgot where it is. But yeah, I want people to use it or improve upon it and critique it and change it. I'm trying to think if there are, like, the classics, they're kind of a little bit more open about their data. They don't seem to like hoard it so much from what I've seen. My professors at Iowa, they have something called BAM, the Big Ancient Mediterranean, and they're trying to bring in a lot of helpful tools that people can use through there. So Big Ancient Mediterranean, they got a lot of fun stuff on there. Also, the Classical Language Toolkit has a lot of helpful things to help you code a lot. And generally, just in DH, there's a lot of free things out there. Oh, yeah. Somebody linked up the GitHub to Ryan Horn. So that would also be a good place to go because he has a lot of helpful things there as well.
I just have a quick question pertaining to like the length of time that it took for you to like from start to finish. I'm not very well versed by any means in like lexicon and data analysis. So was that something that you learned along the way, or were you familiarized with that in undergrad or graduate school?
As I said at the beginning, which seems like forever ago right now, this was the last course I took in my 4 years of schooling in graduate school. So it was the last thing I did. Now, when I was at Wake Forest, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I just blanked on when I was at Wake Forest, I did have some familiarity with statistic programs because I was a psych minor and we had to do a little bit of that, but forgot all of that. And I was basically starting from scratch. So I basically taught myself how to do all of that within 2 years and did it like this. But that's why I keep bringing up Jockers, because he kind of makes it available to us because he's coming from an English perspective. And so that's why I kind of recommended his book as a starting point. So it does take a lot of time to do. It's kind of frustrating. So you'll need some patience also in order to deal with all of these things. But as I mentioned before, if you're very interested in languages, I don't think you should be scared of using R at all because it deals with numbers. It also deals with languages because you're basically writing script as a language. So I think you will be able to do that quite easily. Will take some time, take a lot of patience, but yeah, like I was kind of surprised how I think it was a huge class of like Latin scholars were able to just kind of finagle with R for like a semester, and we were pretty good at it near the end. So it's easier than you think.
Thank you.
And Caitlin, I really appreciated your suggestion or your idea in the talk where you said that you were looking at what people were suggesting that Matthew Jockers do, and then you took that advice and applied that to make your methodology a little bit more robust. So as this conversation has gone, there is this great DH community that is kind of staking their claim to what their topic is, because it does usually, DH stuff does take a little bit longer than your traditional written scholarship. So you do have to stake your claim online, but that also leads to sharing a data set, sharing ideas, and repurposing data sets and codes. So it is this really nice community. Usually it's a really nice community of scholars that is very open and sharing. So just please join me in thanking Caitlin for joining us today. Dr. Marley, it was wonderful to have you virtually back at Wake Forest. And thanks to everyone for attending this DH at Wake lecture. And hopefully we'll see you at other ZSR events soon. Thanks a lot.
And thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.